This is the second part of Chapter 18 on the rise of industry in America. And we left off with the factors needed for industrial expansion, of which America happened to have, coincidentally, all of them in the late 1800s, and particularly the rise of railroads. Without transportation, you cannot have industry. I am continuing on, starting with slide number 10, and one of the early railroad tycoons, besides Jay Gould, who monopolized it, and possibly the first multimillionaire in American history, certainly the richest man of his time for decades, was that guy with the great whiskers on slide 10, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Okay, you know about Vanderbilt. You don't know this, but his great-great-great-grandson is on TV all the time, Anderson Cooper. Cornelius Vanderbilt would probably roll over in his grave if he knew about Anderson Cooper today. So who is Vanderbilt? These are names that are very common in American history that we do hear about a lot in high school. The Dukes in the tobacco industry, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, Schwab, J.P. Morgan, Sears, Marshall Fields. All of these were early multi-millionaires. And the question is, what do you do when you never had these before in America and all of a sudden you have thousands of them by 1900? We have to change our thinking about money and about the accumulation of money. And Cornelius Vanderbilt is one of the big names and probably the first and earliest multi-millionaire. You can tell from his name where he is from. He was born right before 1800 in New York City. The name is a Dutch name, and the family was Dutch. His grandparents came as indentured servants to America. They came with nothing. They owed their service. Father ran a small ferry business, and Cornelius quit school at age 11 to help his father in the business. So he's not terribly well educated, literate, but not very educated. By the age of 16, he is running his own ferry business. So clearly this is a kid with a lot of ambition and a lot of energy. He begins managing other ferries. He buys out other people along the way, and soon he has almost a monopoly on the ferry service in New York City. New York City is surrounded by water, the Hudson River, the North River. You have to get back and forth by ferries. There were no bridges at the time. So this is a very lucrative business. By the 1840s, he has the vision to see what the upcoming transportation system will be, and it was brand new at the time, was railways. And he started to build and buy small connecting railways that ran into his ferries to create a bigger transportation system. By the time of the Civil War, he's putting all of his money into railways. And by the time he died, he owned personally over 30,000 miles of railway, which was a lot at the time. There's a picture of that huge steamer. He started out with little ferry boats. He got into steam transportation. It is not a big jump. Put a steam engine on a boat. Steam engines came around early in the 1800s. Put a steam engine on the boat. You have a steamboat. Take the same steam engine, put it on a wagon, and eventually you have developed a choo-choo train. And Vanderbilt had the vision to see trains. That's the transportation of the future. 1849 comes along, the gold rush in California. If you wanted to get from the East Coast to California on foot, wagon, horse, however, you're only going about 2-3 miles an hour. It took close to a year, 9 to 11 months to get from coast to coast, to get to the gold rush. And people tried to get there as fast as they could. The other alternative you had was to go by boat, and you had to go down around the tip of South America because there was nothing across Panama at the time, and then up the Pacific coast, which also coincidentally took close to a year as well. So Vanderbilt has the vision to see, I'm into railways, I'm into boats. He didn't build a canal. That's a long process and incredibly expensive. But what he did was take his steamboats. You could take a Vanderbilt steamboat from New York City or the East Coast. You could go down to Panama, down to Central America, and he built a short railway across Panama. You could get on the Vanderbilt Railway, you could go to the Pacific coast, and there would be waiting another Vanderbilt steamboat. So this cut the time to get to the Pacific coast in half. So now you could do it in about 5 months. And Vanderbilt became even more wealthy because of it. Kind of like the Walmart of his time. He moved in and everybody else got swallowed up. His methods were very common at the time. Remember, there is no government regulation, which is a good and bad thing. He was absolutely ruthless. He would buy and consolidate smaller ferry lines first and then smaller railways next. If you resisted, I don't want to sell my railway to the Vanderbilts. What he did was he would cut the fares on his own boats and his own trains. And of course, everybody would go where the cheaper fare was, and the other guy would eventually go out of business, and then he would buy him out. There were times when he actually offered free passage in order to drive other people out of business. He creates the first giant corporation in America, Transcontinental Corporation, one of the richest men in American history. At the time he died, in today's money, he would be worth about $150 billion with a B. He was so powerful and so rich, we all know money brings power with it, that he had a huge influence on New York City and New York State politics because he would donate to people who helped him. And at one point he was quoted in the newspapers in New York City as saying, "What do I care about the law? Hain't I got the power?" Remember, he's not terribly well educated. He died at the age of 77, right after the Civil War. He was the richest man in America. He owned 10% of the assets of America when he died, and a lot of it gotten with purely ruthless means. Interesting guy, personally. The family histories I find fascinating of these guys, what I know about it. He originally, when he was a young man and a poor man, he married a first cousin. This was common at the time. They had 13 kids. She died when she was 71 years old, and he was about the same age, and he marries another first cousin who was 43 years younger. Very wealthy older men, marrying very much younger women. Gee, that's never happened in American history, has it? What he did with his money, most of it went to his children, of which he had a large number. He did take some of it and donate it to education. That's why we have Vanderbilt University, was partially funded with Vanderbilt. He did, when he got older, donate to churches, probably because he was worried about where he was going to go after he died. But this is a guy who is totally ruthless along the way. His first wife, who had been married decades to him, they had 13 children together. When he became very wealthy, he built that very large house that you see there, that mansion, in the middle of New York City. It is not there today. It's been torn down. There's a department store there today. But he built this big, huge, very fancy multi-million-dollar house, and his wife didn't want to move. She said, "I like my neighborhood. My children were raised here. My neighbors, I'm very content here. I do not want to move." Vanderbilt said, "Okay, you can either move to the fancy new house I built, or I will put you in," as they called it at the time, a lunatic asylum, which he can do because women did not have much power and husbands had all the power. "I will have you committed to a lunatic asylum." She ended up moving with him. The last couple of slides there, 14 and 15, are Biltmore. Biltmore was built by one of his sons. But this is how much money the Vanderbilts had and still have. Gloria Vanderbilt of the clothing line. One of the older sons, who inherited from Vanderbilt, took the money and bought 130,000 acres in North Carolina in the foothills, a gorgeous piece of property, and he built on it basically a medieval castle, just like in England. He wanted to imitate the wealthy upper-class Englishmen. He built a house with 250 rooms, And of course, because he's not going to be cleaning the toilets and he's not going to be mopping the floors, he's not going to be doing any of the maintenance work on it, you had to have a bunch of people. This was in the middle of nowhere in the mountains in North Carolina. So he built nearby, a couple miles away, an entire village and had 2,000 people in that village that did the grounds, that did the housework, that did all the work on Biltmore. So if you're ever in Western North Carolina, it is well worth going to see. The guy had nothing but money. What he did was he traveled around Europe and he bought Persian rugs and Greek statues and marvelous paintings and German porcelains. And the place is a museum. It is an art museum. It's absolutely incredible. But this is what money buys at the time. Okay. The last slide, slide number 17 in that file, are sample multiple choice questions. If you want to know what the multiple choice questions might look like on the test, those are some examples. And I do make up my own. I don't take them off of some test bank someplace. Okay. I am continuing on this videotape, and I'm moving into the next PowerPoint slide, which is called Owners and Workers. We are still working on chapter 18, moving a little bit into 19. Okay, so this is a real problem in American history now. We have lots and lots of incredibly wealthy people, and nobody knows what to do with them. You had that first slide in there is the Great Corliss engine, which was powering all of the buildings and all of the steam heat in the Columbian Exposition. Philadelphia Exposition in 1876. Look at the size of that machine. Can you imagine anything like this in 1800 in America? People just came just to look at the machine. It weighed 650 tons. It had a mile of shafts and powered 8,000 smaller machines. So this is the great machine age, starting from the late 1800s. Okay, the next picture you have there is a guy with a very good beard, named, of course, if you recognize it, Charles Darwin. And in order to deal with these huge amounts of wealth that America had never seen, and this huge number, thousands and thousands of multimillionaires, people's ideas had to change. Charles Darwin changed the world. I don't know if any of you have read Origin of Species. I highly recommend it. It can't be on the list because it's a pure biology book. I read it about 5-6 years ago. I'd read pieces. I sat down and read the whole thing. It absolutely blew me away. It's absolutely a tour de force, an intellectual tour de force. He had thought about it for 30 years, and he finally had to publish it because he had another biologist who had come up with the same theory, and he was writing back and forth to him and realized we had better do this together so we both get credit for it. Charles Wallace was the other one. So Charles Darwin waited 30 years to publish this theory because he knew the effect it would have, particularly on religion. Darwin himself, who was a strong Anglican, Church of England, became completely non-religious after his 8-year-old daughter died of an illness. And at that point he said, there is no God. I don't believe in it. But he waited because his wife was a devout Christian, and he knew the effect that it would have on religion. In Origin of Species and in everything Darwin did, he never ever talked about people. He only used examples from the animal world. But of course, the first thing that was done with his teachings was to apply them to people and societies. Okay, so I'm reading from the other guy who was published at the same time. I'm sorry, his first name was Alfred Wallace. Darwin would have said the same thing. Why do some live and some die? And the answer is clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. From the effects of disease, the most healthy escaped. From enemies, the strongest, the swiftest, or the most cunning. From famine, the best hunters are those with the best digestion, and so on. And it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation, the inferior would inevitably be killed off and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. And the hashtag, of course, for Darwin is survival of the fittest. The weak die out, the strong survive to reproduce. The individuals are not important. It is the gene pool. And this is where we get a little confused. And for a long time, Lamarck and most Europeans thought, okay, if you have a very tall giraffe, he can reach more leaves. He's probably going to survive in a drought, and his neck is going to get longer. That giraffe is not going to have a longer neck. But the giraffes with a longer neck will survive to reproduce, and their offspring will probably have slightly longer necks than other giraffes in the gene pool. So it is not the individual who changes, it is the gene pool who changes. This is a very contemporary issue because we have some of the same issues going on, not only with COVID, but absolutely with the economy. Okay, so survival of the fittest, the image I always think of is the antelope on the African plains and the lions chasing the antelope. The fastest lions are going to catch things, and the fastest antelope are going to escape. The lions are going to catch the slower antelope. Antelopes over time will get faster and faster. Lions over time will get more and more cunning and swift. So that is survival of the fittest. What does that do to religion? Up until this time, what was the explanation for everything? God ordained it that way. God planned it. Well, what survival of the fittest does, and what Darwin did, and that was his hesitation, is he takes God out of the equation. These are natural processes that occur on their own. God is not in charge of everything. And that's exactly what happened. It doesn't have to be. There's ways around that. Most scientists today are practicing some type of religion. You can separate the how and the why, but the immediate reaction was, of course, God's not in charge. It's just nature, red in tooth and claw. In England, immediately his ideas were taken by a man named Herbert Spencer and applied to societies and to people. In Britain, he was considered a nutcase. Nobody paid attention to him. It was published in America and became widely popular, of course, at first. If you are poor, if you do not succeed economically, then you are clearly inferior, and it is better for society as a whole if you die out. The rich, according to this theory, are better biological specimens. They are better because they are superior in some way. And I have heard exactly this economically and socially. This is not a dead theory. It all depends on natural selection. So the poor deserve to die out. We should not help them because we're just weakening the species. The rich should be encouraged because they are superior specimens. That's the theory. Okay? The Gospel of Wealth was created by Andrew Carnegie. Let me talk about him later. Social Darwinism became Darwin's theory applied to people. Moving down to slide 5, you have a whole series of books, and the main character, there were almost 100 of these. The main character was a young boy called Horatio Alger, A-L-G-E-R. These were published in the late 1800s. These were the equivalent of pulp fiction. They were literally dime novels because they cost a dime, very inexpensive. And they are, there's no other word for it, propaganda for capitalism, I think is the best way to describe them. There were 100 of them. They were widely popular. There were millions of different copies printed. And the theme in every one is poor boy makes rich by pluck and luck. There is a luck factor here, but the boy also has some superior qualities. So, sample plot on a book, read a couple of these, they're pretty crappy fiction. But there is a boy in New York City, and he's a poor boy, and he's selling newspapers for a penny on the corner. And he hears a commotion behind him, and there's a runaway carriage. There were no automobiles, horse and carriage, and the horse has spooked and run off. And being a courageous young lad, he leaps into the street and grabs the rein of the horse and brings the carriage to a halt. And of course, inside the carriage, there is a hysterical young woman about his age, and he comforts her. And she happens to be the daughter of a very wealthy businessman in New York City who's very grateful to Horatio Alger, gives him a job in the company. Through his own great talents, he rises in the company. He marries the beautiful young daughter of the wealthy guy, and they live happily ever after. Okay, another plot. They're all variations on this theme. He's working for very low wages on the dock, hauling stuff around. He hears a splash in the water. Help, help, somebody's fallen in the water. Being an excellent swimmer and a courageous young man, he jumps into the water and rescues, big surprise, a beautiful young woman about his age, whose father, of course, is a wealthy ship owner. He's very grateful. He gives him a job. He rises through his wonderful talents in the company, marries the daughter of the ship owner, takes over the company, and they live happily ever after. You get the idea of this, okay? Luck, whole lot of luck. What are the odds if you're driving down Mopac that you're going to see a lovely young woman on the side of the road? You're going to stop and help her fix her flat tire, and she's going to be one of Michael Dell's daughters. He has 4 of them, by the way. What are the odds that if she is Michael Dell's daughter, he's going to give you a job in the company and let you marry his daughter? Good luck with that. But these were widely popular in America and promoted the idea that all you had to have was a little bit of luck and your own superior talents, and you would become rich and famous. The odds were not good of that, but this is the theory that was being promoted. Okay, I am moving down to slide 6. That guy who looks like Santa Claus really wasn't. I'm not sure, but to me, he looks an awful lot like Colonel Sanders. I'm not sure if he wasn't the model for Colonel Sanders. I have no evidence for that. He looks like a very benign, nice guy. Yes and no. This is Andrew Carnegie. The Scots say Carnegie, we say Carnegie. Carnegie came as a poor, dirt poor young immigrant from Scotland. Now, Scotland, these were Calvinists, they were Protestants. They had a very good school system because everybody had to be taught to read the Bible. So Carnegie is fairly literate when he comes. His father was a weaver. The Industrial Revolution came along. Machines replaced hand weavers. His father was unemployed. They came to the city of Pittsburgh, Cleveland or Pittsburgh, one of them, anyway, in Ohio, because they had relatives there. Okay, so it's Cleveland, I'm sorry, not important, the Midwest. And he has 2 younger siblings. Father never worked again. We don't know the story, probably some serious depression here. At the age of 12, when Carnegie arrived in the United States, he gets a job in a textile factory, and he's supporting the family from this point on. Pretty soon he notices across the street there's a telegraph office. This is a new invention shortly before the Civil War. And he walks across the street and he realizes, hey, I can make more money here. He asks for a job. They give him a job. And he had a unique talent. This is clearly a very smart kid. He had the ability to read. A telegraph is ... the Morse code. And usually telegraph operators would write down letter by letter and it spelled out words. Carnegie had the ability to write the words as they were coming across the telegraph very quickly. He just had this knack for it. So he immediately is promoted. He becomes a telegraph operator. They make him a messenger boy delivering telegraphs to. And of course, since he's Scot, they give him, hey, you deliver the telegraphs to the Scots. So pretty soon he knows all of the wealthy Scots in Cleveland. Who gets a telegram? Not poor people. Who sends telegrams? So he's made very good connections. He makes friends with one of these wealthy guys who is the manager of a small railway. The guy sees how bright this kid is at the age of 14 or so and says, you come work for me in my office. I'll pay you more. Carnegie goes and works for him. By the age, it takes all of his salary, supports his family. Whatever he has left, he invests in the railway company. And by the age of 21, the older guy retires and he becomes manager of this railway. And again, he has the vision. He sees the railway is what will be coming. This is the new technology. And Carnegie began to put all of his money in steel and in railways. Why steel? The railways were fairly new. This is right before the Civil War. And the trains were very heavy, steam-powered, heavy steam engines, heavy steel trains. And as they crossed bridges and trestles, the wooden bridges would collapse. Carnegie says, there's a better way for this. We can make steel bridges. And he shifts his production from railways, his investments from railways. He begins to build steel factories. By the time he died, he was, after Vanderbilt, the wealthiest man in America. He owned, hang on, let me get the numbers here. And he only had 4 years of school, don't forget. He owned, by 1900, 1,000 miles of railway, his own company, 200 factories, 78 ore boats. He employed more workers than the entire population of Maryland and controlled 2/3 of the American steel business. He shifted everything into steel. Put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket, was his motto. He was a genius organizer. He had a number of talents. One of them, we would call him a micromanager today, but he was a great manager, particularly of cost effectiveness. He would walk through his factories almost daily, and he would look for ways to save money. For example, if they built a steel furnace, he would talk to the guys building it and say, okay, now how many bricks do you need for this steel furnace? And they would say, well, we build it with 2,000. He said, see if you can build it with 1,900. And when they did, he would use that pattern and build all the others the same way and save bricks. Another great example is all of the buildings were built of wood in the beginning. These are steel foundries. They melt steel. They melt iron ore into steel. Very high fire insurance, not surprisingly. He realized very quickly, okay, not going to do this. I'm making steel. I will tear down all my wooden buildings and make them with sheet metal, with steel, which he did, and his insurance costs went down to almost nothing. Another great example, he orders a new rolling mill. When the liquid molten steel is poured, there was a machine that smoothed it into a large sheet of steel. This was a British machine that he imported. 3 months later, he ripped the whole thing out and sold it very cheaply to somebody else because somebody had developed a more efficient one. So he is a really cost manager. On the other hand, his workers worked 6 days a week at not terribly low pay, but pretty low pay, going rate at the time, incredibly dangerous conditions, 12-hour days. You are dealing with molten metals, pouring steel. This is a steel foundry. When he became older, he decided to retire and devote himself to charity, and he sold out to J.P. Morgan. Great story. J.P. Morgan wanted to buy him out, had a lot of money, and J.P. Morgan sent his office manager, Charles Schwab, name sound familiar, ask Carnegie what he wants for his business. I will buy him out. He was the largest company in America at the time. And Carnegie said, I don't particularly want to sell. I don't like J.P. Morgan. And Charles Schwab said, give me a number here and I'll take it back to him. And Carnegie just scribbled $500 million on a piece of paper. Took it back to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan didn't even look at the number and said, sold. And so Carnegie sold out to J.P. Morgan, which became U.S. Steel. Carnegie Steel turned into U.S. Steel. I have to stop there. I will talk about what Carnegie did with all his money in the next video. Stay safe.